Welcome, listeners. Some people hurt the world loudly. Others do it quietly, by smoothing things over, by explaining too much, by meaning well. This is not a story about a monster hiding in the dark. It's a story about a good man, a father, a neighbor who shoveled the sidewalk, a man who believed that love given often enough could fix anything and never stopped to ask what it might be protecting instead. It is a psychological horror story about complicity, moral blindness, and the damage done not by cruelty, but by kindness without limits. Content warning: this story contains themes of violence, serial homicide, emotional abuse, moral complicity, and psychological distress. No graphic violence is depicted, but the subject matter may be disturbing. Listener discretion is advised. And now, the record begins here. He Always Meant Well by NoSleep Scribe. The first thing Thomas Harrow did that morning was shovel the neighbor's walk. It had snowed overnight. Soft, clean, the kind that made the streetlights look holy and made the world feel briefly forgivable. Mrs. Dinsmore across the street was widowed and stubborn and 83 years old, and she would have tried to do it herself if he didn't get there first. Thomas had learned the pattern years ago. If he arrived early enough, he could spare her the argument and spare himself the guilt. So he bundled up before dawn, pulled on the gloves Martha had bought him last Christmas, and stepped into the blue hush of morning. The shovel bit into the powder with a familiar scrape, a simple sound, an honest sound. He worked down his own steps first, then the sidewalk to the right, then the Dinsmore's walk, and then, because the rhythm had already taken hold, the small stretch leading up to the hydrant. By the time the sky had started to gray, the street looked tended, cared for, as if someone had noticed it. He liked that feeling. He liked the idea that his hands could make the day easier for someone else. When he finished, he leaned on the shovel handle, breathing out clouds, and watched his breath disappear. Somewhere behind him, a porch light clicked on. A curtain shifted. A life moved quietly in its own small cage of routine. Thomas Harrow nodded to nobody in particular and went inside. He washed his hands longer than necessary. He always did. Soap, hot water, nails clean. Martha used to tease him about it. "You think you're going into surgery, Tom." And he would grin and say it was just habit. A good habit, he told himself, the kind you could build a life out of. In the kitchen, the kettle whistled. He poured coffee into the mug that said "World's Okayest Dad" in faded block letters. A gag gift from his sister. A joke that had gotten less funny as the years went on, not because it wasn't true, but because Thomas had begun to suspect that okay was a word people used when they couldn't bear to say what they actually meant. He drank his coffee standing by the window. The street looked so normal. The snow smoothed over every tire rut, every dead leaf, every crack in the pavement. It hid the ugliness the way a good man might, by tidying, by covering, by making the surface respectable, so no one had to stare too hard at what lay beneath. Thomas finished his mug. Then the phone rang. It wasn't the house line. The house line had become mostly decorative. Telemarketers, appointment reminders, the occasional wrong number. This was his cell. A clean, sharp vibration against the countertop, like a warning. He stared at the screen long enough for it to dim. Unknown caller. For a moment, he didn't answer. He waited for the familiar internal calculations to click into place. the ones he'd practiced for so many years that they no longer felt like thoughts. They felt like instincts. It's probably nothing. It's probably someone else. It's probably not him. His thumb hit accept. Hello? A pause, a breath, the kind of silence that didn't feel empty. Mr. Harrow? The voice was male, controlled, practiced. Not unkind, but not warm either. The kind of voice that had learned to keep its distance for survival. Yes, Thomas said. This is he. This is Detective Salazar with... The name of the department came next, but Thomas barely heard it. The syllables slid around in his mind without sticking. Only one word mattered, and Salazar said it a heartbeat later. About your son. Thomas didn't sit down. He didn't realize he was holding the edge of the counter until the bones in his fingers started to ache. A rational man would have asked which son, if he'd had more than one. A rational man might have asked what happened, or is he okay, or where is he? Thomas Harrow asked the question he always asked first. What is it this time? The detective's pause was small but noticeable, as if Thomas had said something unexpected, as if he had said something too honest. This time, Salazar repeated, and Thomas heard the shift, the weight, the way the words settled differently in the air. This time, we need you to come down to the station. Thomas swallowed. Is he hurt? No. Did someone... He stopped because he didn't know what he was trying to bargain for. A lesser crime, a manageable scandal, something he could still fix. Salazar didn't offer him that mercy. Your son is in custody, the detective said. We've executed a warrant. He's been arrested in connection with multiple homicides. The world did not tilt. There was no cinematic moment where the kitchen spun or the walls leaned in. Instead, something quieter happened. Thomas Harrow's mind reached for the shelf where he kept his explanations, and for the first time in his life, his hand closed around empty air. Multiple? Thomas echoed like the word was foreign. Homicides, Salazar repeated. Mr. Harrow, are you alone right now? Thomas looked around his kitchen, the dish towel draped over the oven handle, the magnet on the fridge shaped like a little church, Martha's old recipe cards in a tin, her handwriting neat, as if she could control the world by naming ingredients properly. I'm alone, he said, and his voice didn't crack. That was the frightening part. His voice sounded the way it always sounded, like a man in control of himself. Okay, Salazar said, I need you to listen carefully. Your son has provided a full confession. Thomas blinked once. A confession. He pictured a child with sticky hands and wide eyes, admitting to stealing change off a teacher's desk. He pictured a teenager forced to apologize after a fight, lips pressed together in stubborn humiliation. He pictured courtrooms and probation officers, and Thomas himself standing between his son and consequence like a shield. A confession was paperwork. A confession was something you addressed. It was not. Full? Thomas repeated. You mean he's saying he did it? Yes. And you believe him? The detective exhaled slowly, as if he'd been waiting for Thomas to arrive at the place the rest of the world had already been standing for a long time. We have corroboration, Salazar said. Details that weren't public, locations, items, information only the perpetrator would know. Thomas stared out the window at the shoveled sidewalk. The snow looked untouched, perfect, as if the world had decided to be polite. "What do you want from me?" Thomas asked. The detective hesitated, and Thomas felt the shape of that hesitation, like a shadow moving behind a curtain. "We want a statement," Salazar said carefully. "Background, history, anything you can provide that might help us understand." "No," Thomas said too quickly. The word came out like a reflex. Salazar paused again. "Mr. Harrow." "I mean," Thomas corrected, forcing himself to breathe. "I mean, yes, of course I'll come down. I'll tell you what I can." He heard himself doing it. He heard himself stepping into the old groove, the old role. Help, explain, smooth, translate, fix. A good man's instincts. "Thank you," Salazar said. "Can you be here within the hour?" Thomas looked at the clock over the sink. 7:12 a.m. Snow still falling in soft flakes like ash. "I can be there," he said, and then, because he couldn't stop himself, because the question rose from his throat like prayer, "Can I see him?" This time the detective's pause was longer. When Salazar finally spoke, his voice was not harsh. If anything, it was quieter, almost gentle. "I don't know if that would be helpful," he said, "for you." Thomas's jaw tightened. "He's my son." "I understand that," Salazar replied, and Thomas believed him. He did. He could hear in the man's tone that he had dealt with parents before. He had heard mothers weep and fathers shout, and families unravel in fluorescent-lit waiting rooms. But understanding was not permission. "Mr. Harrow," Salazar continued, "there are families involved, victims, people who didn't get to see their loved ones again. I need you to come down and answer some questions, and I need you to be prepared for what you're going to hear." Thomas swallowed. "I'm prepared," he lied, because he always had been. He'd prepared for school administrators and angry neighbors and small-town gossip. He'd prepared for judges who looked at his son like a problem, for officers who rolled their eyes like they'd seen it all before. He had prepared for consequences. What he had never prepared for was this: a world in which there was nothing left to negotiate. A world in which his son's actions could no longer be softened into mistakes. A world in which Thomas Harrow's kindness, the version of kindness that rescued and covered and excused, might finally be named for what it actually was. "I'll be there," Thomas said again. Salazar gave him an address, a room number, and a name to ask for at the front desk. The call ended with procedural politeness and a click that sounded too small to contain what had just happened. Thomas stayed where he was. The coffee mug sat in the sink, a ring of brown at the bottom like a bruise. Outside, Mrs. Densmore's front door opened, and she stepped carefully onto the cleared path Thomas had given her. She looked frail in the gray morning, human, temporary. She waved at him through the glass, a small gesture of gratitude. Thomas lifted his hand and waved back, because he was a good man, because that part came easily. Then his phone buzzed again, a text this time, an unknown number. For a second, he thought it might be Salazar with an update, a correction, a misunderstanding. But the message was short, not from the detective, from a number with no name attached, as if it belonged to no one and everyone. "You don't need to beg. I was always here. You simply decided to notice. Thomas stared at the words until the letters seemed to float. His hands were suddenly cold, and not from the snow. He turned slowly, as if expecting someone to be standing in the doorway of his kitchen, as if the air itself might have a shape. "Who is this?" he whispered, because his voice had finally found fear. The phone did not answer, but the silence that followed did not feel empty. It felt occupied. And somewhere inside that quiet, something patient and ancient seemed to lean closer, as if it had been waiting a very long time for Thomas Harrow to be alone. The interrogation room was smaller than Thomas expected. Not claustrophobic, just efficient. A square table bolted to the floor, 3 chairs, though only 2 were occupied, a recorder with a red light already glowing, pale walls that had learned how to listen without reacting. Detective Salazar did not sit across from him. He sat beside him. It was a small thing, thoughtful, almost kind. It kept the table from feeling like a barrier. It suggested cooperation, partnership, 2 reasonable men on the same side of a problem. Thomas noticed. He always noticed things like that. "Before we begin," Salazar said, "I want to be clear about something. This is not an interrogation." Thomas nodded. "Good." "This is a statement," Salazar continued. "You're not a suspect. You're not in any trouble. We're just building a timeline." "Of course," Thomas said. He folded his hands neatly on the table. He had learned long ago that folded hands looked honest. The recorder hummed. Salazar clicked a pen, not threateningly, just enough to give his fingers something to do. "For the record," he said, "state your name." "Thomas Harrow." "And your relationship to—" Salazar paused, checking his notes. "Evan Harrow." "My son." "Age?" 32. "Occupation?" Thomas hesitated. "He's between things." Salazar nodded, as if that answered everything. "And you?" "I'm retired," Thomas said. "I worked maintenance for the district, 38 years. Long time. I like to be useful." Salazar smiled faintly at that. "Most people do." The detective waited. Thomas felt the weight of the silence and rushed to fill it. "I volunteer at the church pantry. I shovel for my neighbors. I keep busy." "I'm sure," Salazar said, writing something down. The pen scratched softly. "Let's start early," Salazar said, "when Evan was a child." Thomas relaxed a fraction. Childhood was safe ground. Childhood had explanations. "He was energetic," Thomas said, "strong-willed, curious." "Any behavioral issues?" "Nothing unusual," Thomas replied quickly, too quickly. "Boy's roughhouse. He got into fights, sure, but..." "But?" Salazar prompted gently. "But he was provoked," Thomas said. "Kids can be cruel. Evan was sensitive." Salazar wrote that down too. "Sensitivity," he murmured. "Did the school ever disagree with your assessment?" Thomas shifted. "They didn't always see the full picture." "Which was?" "That Evan reacted," Thomas said. "He didn't start things." Salazar looked up. "How often did you meet with school administrators?" Thomas frowned, calculating. "A few times." "A few?" Salazar echoed. He turned a page. Our records show 14 documented incidences between 8 and 13. Thomas's mouth tightened. Documentation doesn't mean much, he said. Schools are quick to write things up these days. Of course, Salazar said. And each time you advocated for him. That's what parents do. Salazar nodded. Yes, and what did that advocacy look like? I asked questions, Thomas said. I pushed back when things seemed unfair. Did you ever accept the school's recommendations? Counseling, behavioral intervention? Thomas hesitated. We tried therapy once. And? Evan didn't like it. So you stopped? I didn't want to force him, Thomas said. That can cause resentment. Salazar's pen paused mid-word. I see, he said. So you chose to protect the relationship. Thomas straightened. I chose to be a good father. Salazar did not argue. He turned another page. Moving into adolescence, he said. Petty theft, vandalism, shoplifting. Do you recall those incidents? Thomas exhaled slowly. They were mistakes. Plural. Kids test boundaries. And what were the consequences? Thomas opened his mouth, closed it. He returned the items, Thomas said finally. We apologized. I paid restitution. And legal consequences? There were warnings. Salazar nodded. And each warning ended with your involvement. Thomas felt a flicker of irritation. Are you suggesting I shouldn't have helped my son? I'm suggesting, Salazar said carefully, that help teaches lessons. Thomas laughed once, short and humorless. You think I taught him to kill people? Salazar did not flinch. No, he said. I think you taught him something else. What? Salazar set his pen down. That consequences were negotiable. The words landed softly. Thomas shook his head. That's not fair. Isn't it? I was protecting him, Thomas insisted. The world is hard. It chews people up. A father's job is to stand between his child and that kind of damage. Salazar studied him for a long moment. And who, he asked quietly, stood between the other children and your son? Thomas opened his mouth. Nothing came out. Salazar waited. Eventually, Thomas said, You're twisting things. Am I? Salazar asked. Let's continue. He flipped to another section. Early adulthood, he said. Assault charges, domestic disturbances, one restraining order that was later withdrawn. Thomas's throat burned. Those situations were complicated. They usually are. She recanted, Thomas said. She said she exaggerated. And you helped facilitate that conversation, Salazar said, not a question. I encouraged calm, Thomas replied, understanding. Salazar nodded slowly. Did you ever consider that your encouragement might have been pressure? No, Thomas said immediately. I never forced anyone. Of course not, Salazar said. You didn't touch them. Thomas froze. Salazar continued, voice even. You watched. You explained. You smoothed things over. Thomas felt something cold slide down his spine. I loved my son, he said. I believe you, Salazar replied. I truly do. The detective leaned back slightly. But love doesn't erase impact. Thomas clenched his hands. What are you trying to say? Salazar picked up the pen again. I'm trying to understand how a man described by everyone as kind, generous, dependable, he glanced at his notes, became the final line of defense for someone who now admits to taking multiple lives. Thomas's voice dropped. I didn't know. No, Salazar agreed. You didn't know this. The pen scratched again. But you knew enough. Thomas stood abruptly, chair scraping. I will not sit here and be blamed for my son's crimes. Salazar didn't raise his voice. I'm not blaming you, he said. I'm documenting influence. Thomas's hands trembled. He pressed them flat against the table. I gave him chances, he said. Everyone deserves chances. Yes, Salazar said, but chances without limits become permissions. Thomas stared at the wall. The paint was chipped near the corner. Someone had worried at it over time, picking and picking until the surface gave way. Mr. Harrow, Salazar said softly, your son confessed without hesitation. Thomas flinched. He didn't ask for a lawyer, Salazar continued. He didn't ask for you. Silence. He said something else, though, the detective added. Thomas swallowed. What? Salazar met his eyes. He said he always knew you'd understand. The room seemed to shrink, not in size, but in possibility. Thomas sat back down slowly. The recorder hummed. Salazar let the silence stretch, not to punish, but to allow something brittle to crack. Take your time, he said. Thomas stared at his folded hands. For the first time, they didn't look honest. They looked empty. And somewhere, just beyond the edge of the room, unseen but unmistakably present, something patient seemed to smile. The guard does not rush him. This is the first kindness Thomas notices. They walk down a corridor painted a color chosen to discourage thought. Somewhere behind a locked door, a television murmurs. Somewhere else, someone laughs too loudly, then stops. Thomas keeps his hands visible. He does not know why. The room they bring him to is divided by glass. On one side, a chair bolted down. On the other, another chair bolted down. Between them, a phone mounted to the wall like a relic. Thomas sits first. He straightens his coat, smooths his cuffs, checks his reflection in the glass. Habit, not vanity. He looks like himself. That feels wrong somehow. He had expected grief to rearrange his face. The door on the other side opens. Evan Harrow is thinner. Not dramatically so, just enough to register. His hair is shorter than Thomas remembers. His hands are cuffed in front of him, the metal dull, practical. Evan sits. For a moment they stare at each other. Thomas waits for something to happen. A rush of anger, a surge of denial, a scream. Instead, Evan smiles. It is small, familiar, the same smile he'd used as a boy when he'd scraped a knee and wanted reassurance before the pain arrived. Thomas's chest tightens. Hey, Dad. Evan says, lifting the phone. Thomas hesitates, then picks up his own. Hey, he replies. Silence stretches between them, not empty, not tense, comfortable, well practiced. Thomas realizes with a slow, sick clarity that they have rehearsed this moment their entire lives. Evan glances down, then back up. They told me you might come. I said I would, Thomas says automatically. Of course I did. Yeah, Evan nods. I figured. Another pause. Thomas searches his son's face for something. Remorse, fear, anything that would let him orient himself. Evan looks calm, not defiant, relieved. They're saying a lot of things, Thomas says carefully. Evan shrugs. They always do. Thomas flinches. This is different. I know. Evan's voice is gentle. That's why I told them everything. Thomas grips the phone harder. Why? Evan looks genuinely surprised by the question. Because there wasn't any point not to, he says. You always said dragging things out just makes them worse. Thomas felt the words strike something deep and hollow. I said that about, he stops, about mistakes, about misunderstandings, about things that could still be smoothed. Evan tilts his head. You okay, Dad? The question is instinctive, automatic. Thomas nods. I'm fine. A lie, but a familiar one. Evan relaxes visibly at the answer. Good, he says. I was worried. They sit like that, father and son, mirroring each other's posture. Same forward lean, same careful stillness. Finally, Thomas asks, Did you think about them? About what would happen? Evan considers this, truly considers it. I thought about a lot of things, he said. I thought about how loud everything was getting, how messy. Messy, Thomas repeats faintly. Yeah, Evan says, but I knew you'd understand. There it is again. Thomas swallows. Understand what? That sometimes things go too far, Evan says. That sometimes people push you. Thomas felt the floor tilt. Not enough to knock him over, but enough to make balance an effort. They didn't push you into this, Thomas says, and he hates how weak it sounds. Evan's brow furrows, puzzled. I didn't say that. Silence. Evan leans back slightly, the chains shifting with a soft clink. You always believed me, Evan continues, almost conversational, even when it was easier not to. Thomas closed his eyes for half a second. Belief had always felt like love. I just didn't want you hurt, Thomas says. Evan smiles again, wider this time. You never let me be. The words are not cruel. They are factual. Thomas searches for a rebuttal and finds only memories lining up obediently behind his eyes. A principal's office, a judge's raised eyebrow, a woman crying in his living room while Evan stared at the floor, checks written, calls made, stories softened. I tried, Thomas whispers. I know, Evan says immediately. You always did. The certainty in his voice is absolute. That is what breaks something. Evan lowers his voice. They asked me if I thought anyone could have stopped me. Thomas's breath catches. What did you say? Evan looks at him through the glass, really looks, as if seeing him clearly for the first time. I said no, Evan replies, because no one ever did. The silence that follows is no longer comfortable. It stretches, presses. Thomas feels something rise in him, a reflex older than thought. I should go, he says. Evan nods, unbothered. Okay. Thomas stands too quickly, chair scraping. Dad? Evan says softly. Thomas pauses. Thanks, Evan adds, for coming. Thomas turns back, phone still in his hands. Evan's face is open, expectant, waiting for reassurance. For the first time in his life, Thomas Harrow does not give it. He sets the phone down. The guard opens the door. As Thomas steps away, he hears Evan's voice through the glass. Not angry, not panicked, just confused. Dad? Thomas does not turn around. Behind him, the silence finally learns how to hurt. Thomas Harrow does not notice the avatar at first. That too is familiar. He sits alone in his car in the station parking lot, engine off, hands resting on the wheel, as if still awaiting instruction. The sky has dimmed into late afternoon, the snow dirtied by tires and footsteps, the morning's cleanliness already eroded. He tells himself he needs a moment, that he will drive soon, that this is normal. You always were very good at pauses. The voice does not come from the passenger seat. It does not come from the back. It comes from everywhere his thoughts echo. Thomas exhales slowly. I'm not doing this. You are, the avatar replies. You simply didn't schedule it. Thomas grips the steering wheel harder. I didn't invite you. No, the avatar says. You only made room. Thomas laughs once, brittle. If you're here to tell me this is my fault. I am not here to assign blame, the avatar interrupts. Its tone has changed. Sharper now, thinner, the patience worn down to an edge. I am here to remove insulation. Thomas closes his eyes. When he opens them, the reflection in the rearview mirror does not match his movements. The face is his. The eyes are not. They hold him with an intimacy that feels invasive. You think mirrors accuse, the avatar says. They don't. They clarify. Thomas swallows. I loved my son. Yes, the avatar agrees. You did. The word lands heavily. I would have done anything for him. That, the avatar says, is the problem. Thomas shakes his head. You weren't there. You don't know what it's like to raise a child, to watch them grow and make mistakes and erase them, the avatar finished. You were very thorough. Thomas feels heat rise in his chest. I didn't erase anything. No, the avatar says. You archived it, labeled it not important, filed it under, he'll grow out of it. The mirror shifts. Images flicker, not vivid, not cinematic, flat, documentary. A school hallway, a girl pressed against lockers, a wallet missing from a desk, a woman speaking softly, choosing words that would not anger. I didn't see these, Thomas says. You declined to, the avatar replies. I didn't know how bad it was. You never asked how bad it could become. Thomas slams his fist against the steering wheel. I was trying to keep him safe. From whom? The world. The avatar's reflection tilts its head. And who, it asks, was keeping the world safe from him? The question hangs. Thomas's mouth opens, closes. The avatar leans closer in the glass, its voice dropping, not loud, but absolute. You believed harm only counted when blood spilled. Thomas whispers, "That's not true." You believed love absolved outcome. I loved him. Yes, the avatar said again. And you loved him louder than you listened. The mirror fills with a new image. Evan's face, calm, certain. You always believed me. Thomas squeezes his eyes shut. Stop. You called it faith, the avatar continues. You called it loyalty. You called it being a good man. Thomas feels something crack, not break. Crack implies repair. This is collapse. What was I supposed to do? He demands. Turn him in? Abandon him? No, the avatar says. You were supposed to stop him. Silence. You mistook rescue for righteousness, the avatar continued. Every time you softened a consequence, you sharpened him. Thomas's breathing becomes uneven. I didn't mean for any of this to happen. Intention, the avatar says, is the lullaby the complicit sing to themselves. Thomas pressed his forehead against the wheel. So punish me, he whispers. If that's what you want, punish me. The avatar's voice lowers. You still don't understand. Thomas looks up. In the mirror, the avatar is closer now. Not monstrous, not inhuman, just unmistakably present. I am not here to punish you, it says. I am here to finish what you avoided. And what's that? Thomas asked hoarsely. The truth, the avatar replies. Undiluted. The mirror changes again. Thomas sees himself. Not moments of kindness, not the shoveling, not the checks written. He sees the pattern. Excuse, defense, minimization, repeat, love without limit, mercy without judgment. A boy learning the rules of immunity. No, Thomas breathes. Yes, the avatar says. This is the story you told yourself so you could sleep. Tears spilled down Thomas's face, uninvited and useless. I didn't kill anyone, he sobs. No, the avatar agrees. You didn't touch them. The words tighten. You only watched. You only intervened on the wrong side. You only taught him which lives could be absorbed without consequence. Thomas feels hollowed, scraped clean. What do you want from me? He asks. Confession? Regret? I have nothing left. The avatar's voice softens, not kindly, final. I will leave, it says, when there is nothing left inside you that insists you were a good man. Thomas looks at the mirror, at himself, and for the first time, he does not reach for an explanation. The avatar's reflection begins to fade, not because mercy was granted, but because resistance has ended. As it withdraws, it leaves him with one last certainty. No one took his son from him. He gave him to the world, unrestrained, unopposed, and certain he would never be stopped. Thomas Harrow turns the key in the ignition. The engine starts. The mirror reflects only his face again, and that somehow hurts the most. Thomas Harrow stops at the grocery store on the way home. He does this without thinking, which unsettles him later when he realizes how easily habit resumes its place at the wheel. The automatic doors slide open. The fluorescent lights hum. A seasonal display advertises soup on sale. He picks up milk, whole, not skim. Martha's preference, preserved long after the need for it is past. He adds bread, apples, the kind with skins thin enough to bruise if you look at them wrong. At the checkout, the young cashier smiles at him. "Find everything okay?" "Yes," Thomas says, "because that's what you say." She scans his item. He hands over exact change. She thanks him as if gratitude is still a currency with value. Outside, the snow has begun again, lighter this time, apologetic. When he gets home, the house accepts him without comment. The door opens. The familiar creak in the hinge greets him like a tired friend. He sets the groceries away carefully, aligning labels outward, restoring a sense of order he once believed mattered. He makes soup. He makes too much. He eats at the counter, spoon tapping softly against the bowl. The clock ticks. The refrigerator cycles on and off. The house performs its duties faithfully. Thomas washes the dishes. He dries them. He sets the bowl upside down on the rack and leaves it there, unsure why that feels important. Later, he notices Mrs. Dinsmore's porch light flickering. Without his coat, Thomas steps outside and tightens the bulb. She opens the door partway, wrapped in a cardigan, eyes bright with relief. "Oh, Thomas," she says, "you're always so good." He smiles. The muscles remember how. "Just helping," he replies. She pats his arm. "Your wife would be proud." The words land gently. That is what makes them dangerous. Thomas nods and returns home. Inside, he sits in his chair by the window, the one that faces the street, the one that lets him watch the world pass safely at a distance. He thinks of Evan as a boy, waiting on the porch after school, confident his father would arrive, certain the wait would end. Thomas presses his palms flat against his thighs. For the first time, he does not excuse the memory. He does not soften it. He lets it stand. Outside, the snow keeps falling, covering, not erasing. The streetlight paints everything the same pale color, as if difference were a myth the dark once believed in. Thomas Harrow remains where he is, kind, harmless, too late. The clerk cannot remember when the line appeared. She assumes it was always there. While reviewing the file for final archiving, she pauses at a section marked Patterns Contributing Factors. It is not a field she fills often. Most cases resolve cleanly once intent is established. This one resists summary. She rereads the interview, the father's statement, the margin notes, the absence of escalation where escalation should have occurred. When she looks back at the form, a sentence sits beneath the heading in her own handwriting, neat, precise, unmistakably hers. Delayed resistance functions as consent. She does not recall writing it. The wording troubles her, not because it is inaccurate, but because it feels settled, complete, as if it had been waiting. After a moment, she checks reviewed and closed, saves the file, and sends it to archive. The system accepts it without comment. Later, as she leaves for the night, she notices her reflection in the darkened glass of the office door. For just a second, it seemed to hold her gaze a fraction longer than expected. She turns off the light. The reflection disappears. The record remains.